Alright, so welcome everyone and good evening to the Beaumont Children investigation and implications of cold cases held in the inaugural Social Sciences Week. So before we begin tonight's panel discussion, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to those elders who have walked before us. They hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of the Aboriginal peoples. In acknowledging country today, I also acknowledge that the sovereignty was never ceded by the Gadigal people. The social sciences are an imperative group of academic disciplines, including criminology, sociology, anthropology, accounting, linguistics, psychology and social medicine, to just name a few. They play an important role in shaping the direction of the nation, contributing to knowledge on issues such as human rights, legislation, the national curriculum, climate change and superannuation. Social Sciences Week aims to encourage the discussion between academics, practitioners and the general public to showcase the diversity and relevance of social science research. So in the spirit of this event and in the spirit of Social Sciences Week, I encourage you to Google a social science or Google one of the social scientists here tonight and have a look at what we do and have a look at what the social sciences contribute. So tonight is being live streamed to the Australian Sociological Association Facebook page. So I would like to acknowledge the support of Social Sciences Week Committee, the Australian Sociological Association, the University of Newcastle and the Crime and Criminal Justice Association at the University of Newcastle for helping to bring this event together. Now if you're on social media, if you could use the hashtag if you're tweeting SSW2018. So for those in the live audience, in the case of an emergency, please follow the directions of the University of Newcastle Sydney staff, and toilets are straight ahead and to the right. So tonight our panel is made up of Dr. Xanthi Mallet, who joins us from the UK. So Xanthi is a criminologist and forensic scientist at the University of Newcastle. She worked with the 7 Networks Murder Uncovered team on the Beaumont Children's disappearances in South Australia, as well as the Wanda Beach murderers in New South Wales. We also have Duncan McNabb. So Duncan is an award-winning investigative journalist and author of 10 non-fiction books, particularly on crime. He was a supervising producer of 7 Networks Murder Uncovered and worked on the Beaumont Children case for 12 months. And we have Dr. Ben Lohmeyer. So Ben is a critical youth sociologist and youth worker. He has over a decade of youth work experience in alternative education, accommodation and peace building. And Ben is our resident Adelaidean. And then myself, my name is Joel McGregor. I'm an associate lecturer in criminology at the University of Newcastle, and I'm moderating tonight's panel discussion. So tonight we'll go through the events of the day, the recent investigation, and then we will also be looking at the impact of the social sciences on this case, or how the social sciences can help understand the events within this case. So Duncan, I'm hoping that you can start us off and provide us with a short overview of the case and the disappearance of the Beaumont Children.
Cool. The Beaumont Children, 3 kids, lived in a suburb called Somerton Park in Adelaide, about 1.5 kilometres from Glenelg Beach. 26th of January, I think it was a Wednesday from memory, they decide to go to the beach on their own. Not uncommon for them, they'd been down there before. Their father had actually followed them down a couple of times and made sure they were fine. It was a stinking hot day, around about 39 degrees Celsius. The beach was packed. Back in 1966, it wasn't a public holiday, that came later. You were, if my memory serves me, you'd have the Australia Day and then the public holiday would be tacked on the following weekend, and on the Monday. So the kids would then head off to school the week after that to start the new school year. So pretty exciting time in Adelaide, full of people. The kids hop on the bus early morning, around about 9 or 10. They head to the beach. They're due back at lunchtime or shortly thereafter. Their mother gives them a couple of shillings as a decimal currency came in around about 3 weeks after they disappeared on the 14th of February, which I remember for some reason. That morning they are seen by the bus driver who remembers them. They're seen by the local postman who knows the 3 kids. Jane Beaumont, the eldest, is extremely responsible, incredibly trustworthy. The kids go down to part of the beach near a rotunda. They're seen playing on the beach. They're seen by an older couple chatting to a man, tall, good-looking bloke, late 30s, early 40s, very presentable looking. They're later seen that afternoon. The last person, apart from the person who abducted them, who took them, was a shop assistant. And young Jane Beaumont had gone in with her siblings, and she bought a couple of things from the local pie shop called Winsel's. What was curious about that, what is memorable about that, because she left home with a couple of shillings in her hand, but when she paid for these pies, the shop assistant was quite certain that she paid with a fresh, crisp £1 note. A lot of money for a kid in those days, and that stuck in the shop assistant's mind. It's a fact the police held back for the first 12 months of the investigation. After that sighting, the kids just literally disappeared, and they have never ever been seen again. That afternoon, Mrs. Beaumont is watching for the buses to come back, going increasingly frantic. Her husband comes home. He'd been away, as he's a sales representative. He'd curiously enough been in Snowtown, South Australia that same day. He comes home. She's frantic. He searches the beaches. There's no sign of them. Early evening, he races down to the police station to report them missing. One of the young detectives, and if we play a bit of the video, one of the coppers is still alive, a guy called Mostyn Matters, who was in his mid-80s by now. An example of a copper you'd like to get to know, because even in his mid-80s, he still gives a damn. He still wants to find the children. It's driven him his entire life to find them. And he's still in regular contact with Mr. Beaumont, who is into his early 90s. They still talk. Mrs. Beaumont's in a nursing home. She doesn't remember much about anything, but Mr. Beaumont is still up on money. He's on target all the time. So Mostyn kept in close contact with him, sort of shepherding through their lives, actually, making sure they're okay, making sure they're comfortable. The police didn't react very quickly. The locals did the best they could. Back in those days, they would have needed a lot of assistance from the city, but they didn't get it. So the first 12 to 24 hours were not terribly well handled by the South Australian police. When they realised there was a massive problem coming their way, they finally reacted. So by the middle of the next day, the search was on. And, there was plenty of media coverage, I think we'll see at some stage, looking for the kids. And they found absolutely nothing. It's the biggest manhunt in Australian history at the time. They searched beaches, they searched sand dunes. They eliminated the fact that kids may have had misadventure, either being drowned or a sand dune perhaps collapsing on them. But pretty quickly on they realised that the kids had been abducted. The curiosity about the abduction, one of many, is that abducting one child is not uncommon. Abducting 2 is unusual. Abducting 3 children simultaneously is virtually unheard of. I think Xanthi and I both had a long look for similar cases, and there isn't one. Abducting 3 small children is incredibly complicated, most unusual, and required someone who was very capable of doing it too. Maybe a degree of planning, who knows. And that's the last we saw of the Beaumonts. For years following, there have been all manner of sightings. There was a Dutch clairvoyant, had a vision, and he came out and captivated Australia. In fact, the crowd at the airport for his arrival was bigger than that of the Beatles at one stage. He, of course, had no clue, complete fraud. One other detective became obsessed by it and chased them for years and thought he found the Beaumonts in various places, including New Zealand, the USA, and in Canberra. That was, of course, all completely wrong as well. But he kept trying. And at one stage, the poor family, about a year into it, started getting letters saying, "I've got the children, I'm going to bring them back, meet me somewhere." And that was all, of course, fraud as well, just tortured the poor buggers even more. Their marriage collapsed. They've been living apart now for probably about the last 50 odd years almost. But bizarrely, they're both living very, very close to where the children disappeared. And Mr. Beaumont, not so long ago, when asked why, said it's because they might come home again. So that's a short story of the Beaumonts. It's still a case unsolved. There are, as we've been chasing it, we believe we found the most likely culprit for it. There have been a lot of suspects over the years, and anyone who sort of makes bad Adelaide jokes, as most of us do at some stage, Adelaide has quite a sinister reputation that you may not deserve. But the number of suspects have been vast. Anyone who's perhaps studied Adelaide, there's a suggestion that the culprit might have been the person responsible for the 2 girls abducted from the Adelaide Oval in the early 70s. Unlikely. Suggested they were taken by people involved in what in Adelaide is called the family. The family was this group of sinister, well-to-do, well-connected men, allegedly scooping children off the streets. It's highly unlikely as well. I think, for me, the simplest, which is the result we ended up with, was they were taken by a very capable, very persuasive man. And when Harry Phipps popped up into our lives, as a result, curiously enough, of a book that was published some years ago, and a person came forward who was extraordinarily credible and said, "This man is my father-in-law. You should look into him." And a couple of amateurs, I think, did a great job, committed to finding out the real truth about the Beaumonts. And it was with their extraordinary assistance that we got involved as well and put together the TV special that was up earlier this year. Harry Phipps remains and will always be, in my view, the clear suspect for the Beaumont kidnapping. The sad thing is we don't know what he did with the kids. We had a particularly good idea of what he did with them, but it didn't work out. I still think there are a number of places we'd love to have a look at if the police could be persuaded, which would be the cast-iron factory that some of you may have seen was excavated earlier this year, and possibly upsetting the current owners of Harry's house by setting the police to have a good forensic look around that, the carport and the cellar in the house. Phipps, just as a bit of background, was a well-to-do South Australian industrialist, beautifully connected in politics, policing, worth vast amounts of money, and lived, we were just chatting about this earlier, Harry lived in a house adjacent to Glenelg Beach. It's quite a, I'm reading something, it's quite a sinister looking house. Everything around Glenelg is sort of big and beachy and open and friendly. You get to Harry's place and it's this very large, sprawling house with a huge, deep roof. In the roof there's natting without any windows. Under the floor is a basement. But the house has got a big veranda around it. It's almost as though it's peering at you through a little slit in the Venetian blinds. It's a very unusual looking house. But you stand on the corner of Harry's house and 150 metres that way is the rotunda where the kids were seen with a man that answers Harry's description. 150 metres in the other direction is the pie shop where the kids were seen with their crisp £1 note. Geography often plays a major role in investigations. People tend to operate in areas they feel comfortable with. So when I was standing there, I'm thinking, this is really working quite nicely. This man has got to be able to grab the 3 kids quickly, woo them to a secure place, and do whatever he did with them. That requires, I think, the geography that he's familiar with. He's got to know the place, he's got to know how the place feels and operates, how the beach operates, how he could actually take 3 kids from the beach and take them back somewhere. If you grabbed hold of 3 kids and tried to bundle them unwillingly into your car, everyone would notice. But if you lure them back to your house, which is close to everything, it looks completely natural. And it's the simplicity, I suppose, when you're dealing with old crimes, even new crimes, the simplicity is what should drive you. The chronology of how it happens, but the simplicity. You quite often chat to people about crime and you get these magnificent conspiracy theories. But for me, it's always the simple things. Go back to the chronology, follow the timeline, look at the geography, and take the simple route. And if you eliminate the simple route, by all means, look at something more complicated, but keep it simple. Don't try and perfect something.
Yeah. So, Duncan, you named Harry Phipps there, and I'm going to turn to Xanthi now. Xanthi, in the 7 Network report, you said that the offender was likely to have gained the children's control, and you said that this was an issue of power and control. So the offender, you said, would have been charismatic, confident, and lacked empathy. So can you give some more information about the possible offender who would be able to, as Duncan said, take 3 children?
Well, I think what we can certainly say, he was a very confident individual. If you think about what Duncan mentioned earlier, taking 1 child is not unusual, 2 is very rare, 3 is unheard of. So this tells you that somebody is very confident, very capable of coercing these 3 children, because Duncan's absolutely right that the children weren't forced into a car, under duress. They were coerced wherever they went, be that a house, which seems likely, or whether they got into a vehicle. So this is somebody who's very comfortable around children, probably very skilled through practice at coercing them. And then, they've got to be very confident that they can pull this off. So they've got a plan, they're intelligent, they lack empathy because they're, abducting 3 children. And probably extremely charismatic that they can charm those children and put anyone else's mind at ease as well. So certainly the situation tells you a lot about that offender.
Yeah, definitely. And Duncan, you talked about the New Castleloy site as well. Can you talk about the process that led up to the recent excavation of the site?
Yeah. I suppose having Harry Phipps now as a suspect, you then go and look at the most likely place that he could dispose of the children. That's the hard facts. What was curious is Channel 7 some years ago broadcast one of the news reports that had Harry Phipps not named as a suspect, but originally then they named him. And the curiosity is that a bloke was sitting down having dinner. He's watching the Channel 7 news over dinner. He sees Harry Phipps in the story, and he thinks to himself, or he actually says to his wife, I'm sure we dug a hole in that place all these years ago. And the guy was really credible. He's a retired engineer, fantastic bloke, and he was working with his brother, who's a very senior education bureaucrat. The two of them had a long conversation, and they were certain that it was the Australia Day long weekend in 1966 when they were asked by this local bloke, Harry Phipps, who had a factory, to go and dig a hole. The guy was particularly strange. He was tall, well-dressed, drove a Pontiac sedan, quite distinctive at the time, paid them in crisp £1 notes, and was a bit creepy, very cold. And they dug in the middle of the Castleloy site, pretty much in a sort of dark corner of it. They dug a hole, and they remembered that the hole was, to be precise margins, neatly dug, and the same size as the grave. They dug this hole, he paid them, and then told them to take a hike. And they remember it with great clarity. So it was, they'd been to the site once before with the police for a dig that was done a couple of years ago. The police unfortunately didn't do their homework properly and took them to the wrong place. They didn't even bother to check, let me be critical, get it out of the way. The police didn't even bother to check that the place, the dig site was in fact on Castleloy property. It wasn't. So when Sandy and I were down there working on it with a few people, we got hold of a 1966 aerial map. Pure coincidence that this beautiful photograph, of the Castleloy site at the time the Beaumont kids went missing. And we showed it to the fellas. They both looked at it, they considered it at some point, and they went to X marks the spot. And they were quite certain. We then took them back with the aid of the police, who actually decided to come and have another look at this point, and narrowed down the site as where they had dug the hole. And that's where Xanthi got involved with the experts and did some ground penetrating radar and other technology.
And we might get Xanthi
Yes.
to talk about the new technologies.
Yeah, well, when I was asked to look at this, because my first degree is in archaeological sciences, so having done some imaging techniques as part of that degree, I thought we would be looking for somebody to use ground penetrating radar to look beneath the surface of the soil, because we were tasked in essence with looking at this discrete area of ground that the brothers had identified to determine whether there could possibly be this site, this hole that they had dug, whether we were then in the right spot, and if we were, if there were any areas of interest, what we would need to do to have those excavated. So I did some searching around and I found Dr. Ian Moffat from Flinders University. So he's a geologist with an expertise in all of the imaging techniques that are used for looking underneath soil, but it could be underneath, through water as well. So looking for shipwrecks or archaeological burials is one of the things that he normally does. He doesn't normally do forensic work, but we certainly needed that type of expertise in this case. Then we spoke to Ian, and he suggested he came to the site, had a look around, looked at the soil type, looked at the size of the area, and determined that electrical resistivity, which is a different type of technique to radar, would be more appropriate for that particular soil type. So ground penetrating radar clearly sends radar down into the earth, and it sends back a picture that can be interpreted for anomalies. Now with resistivity, it sends an electric current into the ground, and neither technique is, I would say, better than the other. They have different strengths and weaknesses depending on the soil or area that you're looking at. And the resistivity, which is the one we went for, allowed us to search a large area. So we did an area much larger than the actual area that the brothers had identified as of interest, to see, what else was around there. And what came back, fascinatingly, was the fact that the boys were exactly right. There was evidence that there was an anomaly, which is all the scanning can tell us. It's not going to show us bodies, it's not CSI, but it will show us that there's something different about that area. And there was a distinct piece of ground that was about 2 meters long by about 1 meter wide, by about 2 meters deep, exactly where the brothers said they dug a hole. So this was clear evidence that they had in fact dug that hole in precisely the spot that they suggested. More importantly, it also showed that the larger area that we looked at didn't have any evidence of digging. And the resistivity allowed us to see that because when the soil would go back into a hole, it captures oxygen and will actually change the way the current moves through that soil. So that's the way in which the technique works. Ian then interpreted that data, and that's when we went forward to the police.
Uh-oh.
It's a horrible photo to
Anyone got a phone?
Let's just capture that.
Oh,
Good though.
Okay, we'll give her.
Hello. Hello. I lost the big chat. I was in full flow.
And like the face that you
Oh no.
froze on the ground. I took a photo of it.
Oh.
It'll be on Twitter shortly.
Wait, I'm going to call you back. I don't know why this is not working. There we go. Perfect.
You're red now.
Do you know where you left off, or do we want to move on?
Oh, well, what was the last thing that I said to you? Because I can then wax lyrical again.
Now listen carefully, I'll say this only once. I think we just covered the broad area.
Right, okay. So after we covered the broad area, we then needed to determine whether that site of interest, actually represented a potential dig site. So did I explain to you about how the resistivity works?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ian then searched the site. He actually used both techniques to search the site because we were interested to see the comparison between the two, and they would offer back different information. So he used both of those technologies over the course of about 3 days. He then interpreted that information. There was, in fact, a grave or a hole that appeared to have been dug around 2 meters by 1 meter wide by around 2 meters deep, which, as Duncan was saying, is the kind of archetypal grave size. So this validated what the brothers have been telling us all these years about how to dug a hole. So then we presented that information to South Australia Police, and it was really up to them whether they wanted to move ahead with an excavation, whether they felt that was reliable enough and important enough information. And they did. So that was the next step for us as a kind of investigative team to start to look at that site to see what was in the hole.
And then Duncan, do you just want to give us like a very brief outline of the steps after that? And then we will talk about the meshing of hard sciences and soft sciences.
It was anticlimactic, to put it mildly. Xavier was down there on the day. I was actually avidly watching at home. Despite every clue, and investigation is one of my favourite phrases. Investigation is literally you throw all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle on the table and you start building them in until you get to that one piece. The dig site was the final piece and it didn't fit. So we don't know. The Beaumont kids weren't there.
Can I jump in? Say
Absolutely.
it didn't fit. You know, well, we've talked about this afterwards, haven't we, what we think happened. I'm not sure it didn't fit exactly. I think that potentially if Phipps is in fact the offenders, and that was what we were exactly meant to do. We were meant to find the brothers, had we been the investigators 52 years ago. We were meant to go to that side, find the hole, and there's nothing in it. So in fact, I think the pieces of the puzzle did fit. If you were trying to set yourself up with a pretty solid alibi, this was the way to go about it.
Right puzzle.
Yes, right puzzle.
Yeah.
This wasn't the very first piece.
And I suppose it's in part you're getting into the head of Harry Phipps. The guy was extraordinarily bright, devious as all get out, a great manipulator. And we had this discussion, were we actually the final people he manipulated?
Yeah.
Which also brings us at the tantalizing question is, if not there, then where? And that's why I suppose if we had our way, we'd be digging up a lot more of Castlewood and upsetting the current occupants of Harry's house.
We would, yeah.
And contemporary technology actually might help if the coppers want to go down that line to see whether or not there are sort of forensic clues, for example, in the house to eliminate the house. There's, it was tantalising. A very good bloke called Bill Hayes is a fantastic investigator who helped us enormously with this. Interviewed Harry's son, Hayden. Hayden's no longer with us, he died a couple of years ago. And Hayden always kept talking about how his belief his father was responsible, some clues as to what he'd seen his father do. But he also kept referring to a hole. And just in the back of our minds, and thinking about it, he also had one of those of us old enough to remember how you used to know you were doing well when you had an inspection pit for your car in the carport. So you could drive the car in and get underneath it and do an oil change. Very old-fashioned Australian. And Harry had one of those in his carport. He had a big inspection pit, which was curiously enough filled in not long after. Likewise, he had a basement. And there is one suggestion from the son that the children may have been shot inside the house. The likely location would have been the basement. Is there evidence of, for example, any forensic things like ballistics evidence, blood spatter patterns, all these bizarre things that you can look into, all these bizarre things that might show up 50 odd years later, 60 odd years later almost.
So,
I wonder if they're at Castlewood though, because if you were going to hide them somewhere where no one was then going to look, say the evidence, led to that hole, so that's dug up, it's not there, they would just scout the factory as a site.
Yep. And I suppose the point you were making when we were doing this too is someone like Harry Phipps really wanting the power of knowing where they were.
Yep.
Knowing, it's that big secret, as Anthony and I talked about this something, knowing Harry Phipps having this secret. Because Harry Phipps had a few secrets. He had an absolute obsession for satin and would dress himself up in clothes that he'd make himself. We tracked him down to a club in Adelaide where certain members of the Adelaide establishment would gather once a month for a Saturday night and they'd cross-dress. It wasn't that uncommon in the period. So Harry was a man who kept this second life very, very secret. So knowing where 3 kids were buried would give him, I think, an enormous amount of pleasure, a little secret knowledge. It's not uncommon with killers like Harry, is it?
No, absolutely. I think he would have wanted to keep them close for security reasons on his own site. Then no one's going to be digging it up without his knowledge and permission. But yeah, that secret satisfaction that you get with knowing where they are when everyone else is looking. Imagine the media, public attention on this, and he's the only one who knows.
Sitting in that house overlooking the beach and watching the flurry of activity ground, and hundreds of coppers, helicopters, boats, emergency services. They drained, just adjacent to Harry's house is this gigantic swamp. It's called the Patawallaga Swamp, which is just basically a bloody great lake. And the coppers actually drained the lake and went through it foot by foot by foot within about a week of it happening. So Harry's sitting there watching all this and probably quite excited by it.
So I'm going to cut in there so we can continue to move on. Xanthi, you said before that this investigation bridged the hard sciences and soft sciences, to use colloquial terms. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, a lot of the work that we were doing from a criminological investigative point of view is very much kind of what would be classed as a soft science. And it was those, those trails that you follow, those people that you talk to, those maps that you find, Duncan. There was a real gift to the investigation. Married with the hard sciences of what Ian Moffat could offer in terms of the geology of the area, the new techniques for imaging of the ground that weren't available a few years ago. So remember the dig that was in the wrong place a few years ago? Had they used ground penetrating radar then, the soil is very similar, so they wouldn't have found the right area anyway, because the techniques available at the time wouldn't have answered the questions that they were asking. So it was very much a marriage of that investigation, criminological, sociological interpretation of the victims, the scene, the offender, married with those advances, which are very recent. The resistivity has never been used in a forensic capacity before. So this was really groundbreaking in a number of ways, the way we married these together and took the information to the police. So it was bringing together all of those different elements, all adding something to this puzzle that without any of those, we wouldn't have been able to progress the investigation at all. Yeah.
And so we'll continue on with talking about the sociology and bringing in Ben here. So Ben, we've previously talked about this case as fundamentally questioning, challenging the nature of childhood, and you've said to me before that it serves as a culturally significant moment at which the popular notions of innocence in childhood changed in Australian culture. And Duncan, we've talked about this as well when we had the meeting for this. So Ben, as a youth sociologist and as a youth worker, I wonder if you can expand on the nature of childhood in this case and the importance of that.
Yeah, great. Okay. So I think one of the things that certainly stands out to me, but maybe also just to the modern mind, is in this case is the supervision of the children. So they went to the beach by themselves, and for children at that age to do that today is almost fairly unthinkable. You wouldn't expect that to be standard sort of parenting practice. And so the narrative that surrounds that within, for example, the documentary that came out earlier this year is that there was during an age of innocence for these children. So the children could wander in the community, and that was fairly acceptable. And then after these kind of incidents, and I believe there's another similar kind of incident that happened is it in Sydney with a young boy as well who disappeared around the same time, and that was fairly big in the media space. That's the one, thank you very much. So those sort of instances supposedly changed the nature of childhood in Australia, at least changed the way that we think about it. And I find that really interesting because for me it speaks to more than just parenting practices, but what happens in the culture at the time and even say the geography. So just yesterday I went back to the street where the Beaumonts live just to observe the space that's there. And if you're sitting there and you can see there's a mixture of sort of the houses that were built around the time and some new developments. And the suburb itself is kind of located between these major arterial roads, but within the suburb it's quite quiet. And there's houses have low fences, and so you can see into them. You can imagine children playing in that space during that time. Almost strangely, as I was sitting there for just a couple of minutes, these two young boys scooted by with their dog without any parents, and they're probably around 10 years of age, and I was reinforcing that this is a safe space for children to play. And so the idea that changed is interesting because it says there are other dynamics that suggest perhaps rather than that being a time of innocence and we're moving into a time where child has lost that, perhaps it's actually almost the reverse. Perhaps childhood has become increasingly innocent, or this idea that we are supposed to have innocence in childhood is now increasingly being protected by adults. So for example, you've got parents around that time who have lived through World War II and the Depression, and what they're trying to do is carve out this space for their children to have this innocent childhood, and so they're more protected. And there are other social dynamics like the introduction of cars. So around that time, there's some stats that say something like 1 in 10 people owned a car. So the street is a relatively safe place because these cars are slow moving and there's not many of them. Fast forward 30-40 years and cars are much more prevalent, they go a lot faster, and so you can't play in the street in the same way and the same level of safety. And the other dynamic I was thinking about, you mentioned earlier, was these lots of people identified the children on the day. There was the postie, the shopkeeper, the bus driver. All these people knew the children, and they were supervised, maybe not necessarily by a parent, but certainly by the community. So it's interesting to sort of interrogate some of the dynamics that change around parenting practices and the use of public space. And I think, I would almost invert that narrative and say, childhood has increasingly become this innocent space because it's increasingly protected.
And do you think that's one of the reasons why this case, aside from the fact that we still haven't found it, is so compelling and people grip onto it so fiercely?
Yeah, because they identify with the desire to protect children, I suppose, in that way. And also I think people have that nostalgic memory of a time when people played in the street, and the desire for that community that exists around people like that. There's another little bit of interesting research that asks the question whether people stopped playing in the street because it was no longer safe, or is it because people stopped playing in the street that it's no longer safe? The idea that children actually play a really important part in building community in a street in a suburb like that. There's this nostalgic desire for that era again.
And Duncan, I wonder if you can add to that and talk about why the case is still so compelling for people in relation to crime and criminality.
It's a whole sort of a mix of reasons. One thing that I would always forget, so I'll do it first. It's the first time in Australia that the media are actually on-site broadcasting. What we went from, 1966 was the first outside broadcast anywhere. So we saw all of a sudden all of Australia could watch the action in Adelaide unfolding as it happened. And it was a huge event. So it's imprinted in our psyche, one, because we saw the pictures. It was carried by every newspaper in Australia at the time it went overseas. So there's that line in the sand there in our minds that all of a sudden, for the first time ever, we're actually part of it. We can see what the police are doing. We can see the families. We're seeing interviews. So it becomes real for us in that first instance. Secondly, the bizarre nature of the crime. On Australia Day, 3 kids at the beach, like thousands and thousands of other kids. They disappeared. Never seen again. Parents' worst possible nightmare. You can't even conceive of what those parents went through that day. So there's a lot of reflection on that. I'm the same age as Jane Beaumont. So I keep thinking, occasionally when I was making this, I keep thinking, what was I doing in 1966 on that day? Pretty much what they were doing, walking across the road to the beach. That's all I was doing. I was about 8 or 9 or whatever it was. So there's that memory for a lot of us there. The reason so many of these cold cases attract interest, thank goodness that they do, is because it's a mystery unsolved. People want resolution. I'm not a huge fan of the word closure because I don't think you're ever going to close down something like this. But what it will do is bring finality for the parents, the families, the friends, and in many cases too, the emergency service people, the coppers who handle these cases, are forever. Mostyn Matters, who was, we interviewed, 85 years old, and still actively helping the case that he, I think he was 25 or 26 when it happened. He's 85 now, and he was devastated when we didn't find it. He was with us every step of the way to help. So it's important for these people that we get that resolution. that the case, the mystery is solved, brings that finality. You'll never get over it, but at least you're not guessing anymore. You're not hoping, you're not wishing. You don't wake up in the morning thinking, where the hell are they? You know what's happened, it's resolved. The other thing, of course, that I bang on about occasionally is too, if you don't take an interest in these cases, if you don't keep pushing, if you don't take it to the public, because the public will help you solve it. They have the knowledge you don't. I don't know. But someone out there may finally start talking, or that little snippet of information comes back and you think, this is a new dark bush to go down. Because somewhere out there, there's a murderer. The murderer of the Beaumont kids, we think is Harry Phipps, and Harry died of natural causes. But there are so many other cases that are this old and perhaps more recent. The murderer is still walking around free. It's just not acceptable, I'm sorry. Now, I remember I traced, years ago when I was at the ABC, we traced a war criminal called Conrad Calais, the Nazi responsible for deaths of hundreds of people. And I remember getting a lot of flack saying, oh, but he's old, why are you doing this? Well, he's old, he's a murderer, he's an utter thoroughgoing bastard, so why shouldn't we? Why should he go quietly into the night? I think society, God forbid I should say this, society expects us to do this job. There's not much point having a court for justice if you're not going to use it. So this is why these people need to be fixed up.
So on that, can you talk about the ethics of looking at cold cases from a journalistic perspective?
Yeah, it's the curiosity is that when you deal with these cold cases, off the top of the head, 1 in 10 will ever get to the press for us, but we'll do a lot of work. Exactly, I've done a lot of work on cases that will never see the light of day in the media for a lot of reasons. But you do them anyway because you can actually help. This is what you do. And it helps the family. It can nudge the police into action. Sometimes the coppers can be a bit hard to budge. Sometimes they're great. Nothing gets the police moving faster than the front page of a newspaper. Guaranteed to speed. But in most cases, in a lot of cases, you'll deal with families and people involved. Some of them will actually come to you for that assistance because they know that you're pretty much the last resort. They're not getting any satisfaction or support anywhere else. Their case is gathering dust in a gigantic backlog. So let's see if we can move it up a bit. And in many cases too, if the families haven't come to you, go and see them and you can judge. And so few people ever say, no, I'm not interested. They want that resolution. I spent Sunday morning at Long Bay Jail interviewing Roger. He invited me out for a chat, which scared the hell out of both of us, I think. And when I got home, Roger has a lot of victims. And the daughter of one of them rang me and she said, how did it go? Because I told her I was going as a courtesy. I said, we want to talk about his appeal. And all she wanted to know was what I thought his chances of appeal were. And I said, look, they're about 10% at best. And she said, do you think we can nail it down to 0? And this is a woman whose mother died 35 years ago. So that gives you, this is what we do. This is why people want that finality. They want to know that they've exhausted all opportunities to resolve the case. So if we can give them better certainty, fantastic, that's what we're here for.
And Xanthi, do you want to comment on that? And in relation to teaching as well, because you use often these cases, you draw upon them in your lectures and tutorials and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's really important as well, because a lot of the time that we'll look at these cases, I mean, if I mentioned Ivan Milat to you, everyone will know his name, right? How many people in that audience could name the victims of Ivan Milat? A few of you who've studied them, maybe, some of the students, certainly I've studied them with. And I think it's about that too. When you talk to the victims and the victims' families, you remember that they're all people. So you're telling a story, but it's a person's story. It's not ours as the media, it's not the public's, it's somebody's life. And we often know about the offenders, but the victims get forgotten. Their names get forgotten. And they disappear. And for a lot of the victims' families, they want the opportunity to share their story, their voice. And my experience has been when they have taken that opportunity, it's almost a cathartic experience for them where they can almost let it go. know, because they see so much in the media. Imagine if it's a massive case like the Beaumonts, and you're watching that as somebody who knew the Beaumonts or one of their family, and you're hearing other people's interpretation of your story. So having that voice yourself, which the media can give to some of these victims and their families, it's really incredibly powerful on a personal level for a lot of these people. So we do get criticised for telling these stories, but I think without that kind of background of understanding of why we do it and the help it can bring to the victims and their families, even if the case is never solved, just to share their moment with the world and have, you know, their voice is really incredibly powerful. And that's really important to me in my teaching as well, because broadening the students' minds is not just about the offenders they'll have heard of, it's not just about the fact that it's an amazing story that captured the world, it's about the people, it's about the victims and what bringing closure, or at least some portion of that, can mean to them as people. So really important, I think, that students recognise the humanity in a lot of the things that we do. That's certainly what drives me to do it, and I know Duncan feels the same. It's about that humanity element, and that's why police do it, and most of the people I know, they're great people who just want to help.
Can I add something as well? Because I think the dynamic of the media, as I think you said, the first time it's been kind of broadcast at the same level, is a really interesting social dynamic, and it certainly plays into, I think, some of the changes, or that, again, the age of innocence. There's an increasing accessibility of this kind of knowledge in the public space, and an increasing awareness of the risks to children or to other people, you know, as the prevalence. What I suppose to say is not necessarily that the prevalence of crime has changed, but the awareness of it has changed, and that influences people's behaviour. So I think, as I reflect on that as a youth sociologist and a youth worker, part of the value of continuing to talk about or to learn from these kind of cases and having them in the media is an opportunity to inform practice as youth workers, but also to change our perceptions about the type of perpetrators that might be involved in this kind of activity. I think one of the things, again, from the documentary, maybe you can fill me in here a little bit, but that Harry Phipps wasn't originally on the radar as a suspect because he didn't fit the profile of the expected perpetrator at the time. You expected somebody who was essentially the cliched image of a pedophile, not somebody who was powerful, charismatic, well-dressed. So that kind of change in the understanding of the nature of who's involved in these kind of crimes is an important learning from this, I think. But the flip side of that, in some ways, I could make the argument that it has the effect of changing the way that we think about young people and children for the negative. And we might push them back into that phase of innocence rather than seeing them as capable, because we are more scared of the kind of thing that can happen to them. So that's a flip side, maybe a negative to that heightened media exposure as well.
And so Ben, we'll stick with you for a second. What do you see the social sciences contributing to true crime?
Okay. So the thing that I think that I'm interested in is the broader questions about how did we get here, and what are the implications of these cases, and what are the social context, cultural contexts that lead up to these sort of crimes, and then what are the results of them. So that's why I'm interested in things like media and the discourses around youth and childhood. So what are the effects? And then also, as a youth worker, what are the practices? What are the things that we should then do with that information? Does that inform what our next step is? How do we stop this from happening again? And that's kind of my interest as a social scientist.
Yeah. And what about yourself, Sandy?
Well, I think it's the flow on that I think is really interesting. So if you look at something like The Teacher's Pet, okay, so it's about now very well known potential crime, at least the disappearance of Lynn Dawson, looking at Chris Dawson as the potential suspect. But it's also about the culture. So we've got investigative journalists looking at the culture in the schools that allowed allegedly Chris Dawson and others to groom schoolgirls. So it's about that nature of innocence and childhood, and how this whole area or this whole school kind of system could actually breed this type of behaviour in a group of males, and then they're being investigated now historically. So that's, if I would class investigative journalism as a type of sociology, one of the social sciences, bringing those knowledge to the So I think it's those flow-on effects. So you've got a really interesting crime, but what does that tell us about society at the time? What does it potentially tell us about society now? Is this something that's ongoing right now in schools? You know, so I think it's those flow-on effects that you get in the social sciences and what they can bring to true crime that really make people start to ask those big questions about what was going on that allowed the situation to develop.
And Duncan?
I agree with Xanthi. I think it's. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the gay murders in Sydney, and I think, particularly just listening to what you're saying, it happened at a remarkable time, but we have to look at the factors as to why it happened. It happened because of political pressure. It happened because of the arrival of HIV. It happened because of attitudes in the New South Wales police force. It happened because of the attitudes of certain people in New South Wales Parliament. This horrible confluence happens, and one of the results of that is that a group of youths thought that gay men were an easy target because, one, they knew where they congregated, two, they knew they were somewhat socially isolated, and three, they knew the coppers may or may not be that interested in vigorously pursuing them. Fabulous, let's try them. Typical target for a predatory group more than anything else. So I think we learn so much from these periods. We also learn, just from an investigative point of view, how to do things better, how to use contemporary technology, how contemporary technology can actually be taken back to an older case and get a result. Xanthi and I talk somewhat a lot about the capacity to use modern technology on cases that are 20 or 30 years old. We've only had DNA in investigations around since the very late 80s when it started. So that's a whole brand new world for us to go and look at. And for me, if we use the combination of these things and put some light on these old cases, it might just shake something loose to bring them to an end. You know, it's a fair and just thing for everybody, not just the victims, their families, their friends, and so on. Everyone benefits by these things, by resolving these old cases. I go back to what I've always said: if some bastard's walking around free when they should be in jail, let's see what we can do to get them behind bars.
And Duncan, where to now with the Beaumonts? Could I ask that? Could I not ask that?
Oh, you could ask it.
Remember that we can see you, Xanthi.
A big nudge to the South Australian. Look, I think let the South Australian police cogitate over what they've been given. They learned a lot from this experience with us as well. They've finally got themselves a bloody good suspect for the Beaumonts. Hopefully they'll feel more motivated to look into Harry's other potential sites, the house, the rest of Castorloy, and get really serious about it and resolve this mystery. Maybe that's what it'd be like. And maybe, just maybe, with all the publicity it's got lately, maybe someone might have seen something. A lot of them won't be upright anymore, but it only takes one. So you sort of, people like, we're eternal optimists. We may see the worst in life, but we also expect the best sometimes as well, which would be someone coming forward and say, hey, I remembered something. And as we found out when we were doing this, Harry's victims that survived came forward. So Harry went from being a bloke who was a pillar of the community, suspected of being the Beaumonts' murderer for a lot of reasons, to a man we actually now can prove was a sexual predator. With people who have come forward, they're credible, they're honourable, they tell the story of an absolutely horrid human being. So we didn't know this before we did this program. We surmised, we don't know, now we have facts. The coppers have now got much more to go on than they did before, so hopefully they'll dig out the equipment and go and have another look.
So, before we open up to questions, both from the live stream and from the audience, is there anything that the panel would like to add to finish off?
Well, I think I'll just follow just very briefly what Duncan just said. I think that is an excellent point. You know, when we did the investigation, we found extra victims of Harry Fitz, and again, the very first one ever, they had a voice to tell their story. Something they've kept to themselves for over 50 years now, and somebody was interested in them. We were interested in hearing what they had to say. So that's where the real power comes from for me. And I really hope that we find the children one way or another. But if not, at least the police have some investigative leads now, which they didn't have before.
Does anyone have any questions? Yep.
Yeah. With Harry, he wouldn't have been able to travel that far because of the vehicle he had in Maringi Avenue up through Castleroy. It was all open. So he would have been seen, but he had easy access from going home to Castleroy. Now, whether he dug that grave as a decoy, initially I thought he had, but I think he possibly was going to bury those children there. Then he had second thoughts, and Castleroy's got furnaces. Has the police ever done forensic analysis? Because those furnaces would have been built up over the years, because you have to build the furnace up.
They've done absolutely
Have they
nothing.
done any forensic analysis in that area?
No, I don't think I'd be too unkind suggesting they had to be not dragged, but certainly nudged firmly to get it. Yeah, prodded, yes, that's more
Well,
polite.
the only place he could go was from home, because that vehicle he had, I'll tell you a story later, but it used to happen around that area. And he was a typical camper. He was probably that person.
Why do you need to go beyond the basement?
Just in case.
Well,
Well, no one can establish where in the house. If something happened in the house, no one knows where it happened. I'm old-fashioned. I take police work. When you go to search a room, you will start at the roof and you'll work down to the floorboard, so you won't miss anything. The house is exactly the same. The basement could be somewhere interesting. The attic could be somewhere interesting. Start from the top but work all the way down. That way you won't miss anything.
There's a story about a white house in that basement. Is that mythology?
No, it's a good point. It's not. I've interviewed, Xanthi's interviewed the bloke who found him. He didn't make anything up. It's a bizarre story. Jane Beaumont, just to quickly go through it, Jane Beaumont had a little white purse the day she left home. Years and years later, a bloke called Stuart Mullins, who's the fellow who actually started work on Harry Phipps, the gifted amateur, who just doesn't give up. He inveigled his way into Shay Phipps after Harry died, started talking to Harry's second wife. She gave him the guided tour of the house. Downstairs, in the basement, they're wandering through. He sees the purse. It twigs with him a little bit, but not enough, because he doesn't know enough about the case. He gets upstairs, goes back to the hotel where it was, rings his mate who's writing about the case, who knows it backwards, and says, I've seen this in the basement. The guy goes, bang. Stuart goes back a day or two later, doesn't quite get the warm reception he had the last time, and the purse is gone. Mrs. Phipps says to him, because he asked him what happened to him, he said, I bought that at an op shop and just put it in the basement a couple of weeks ago.
We should add that she's a millionairess, having inherited Phipps's estate.
Yes.
So, you know, I'm not saying she wouldn't go in an op shop, but why would she go and buy a child's purse in an op shop?
The whole thing is just really weird. Op shop, cheap purse, put it in the basement, give me a break. And the other thing about it, and this is why the observations are so important when you're doing this sort of work, is that the basement also had lots of Harry's memorabilia, suitcases. Harry was a bit of a hoarder, but everything was meticulously lined up and kept beautifully. And the purse is sitting there amongst this beautifully placed stuff. Yeah, it wasn't a basement like my place. You walk in my place, you go into a basement if I had one, and you'd fall over and break your neck. This place was laid out methodically, and the purse was in the right spot. So it was in place rather than looking out of place. Stuart just noticed it.
Any other questions?
There is a lot of mystery, obviously, surrounding this case, and I think people feel a sense of great mystery when they think about it, and often overlook the brutality that this is in fact a sex crime. Is that how we should understand it? And does it help to understand it as a sex crime?
Sorry, shall I jump in? Until we know what happens, that we can't confirm who the offender may be. Our assumption is that there's a particular offender. I would still argue though that a sex crime is still a crime of power and control. So whoever took the children may have had a sexual inclination to children. However, for me, this crime speaks of dominance, power over somebody weaker. So it may be a sex crime, but we still have the elements of power that are essential here.
Yeah, I suppose too. Harry's victims, as we learned more about Harry's victims, particularly as people came forward. There is a great diversity from potentially kids 4 or 5 years old through to women in a couple of cases in their early 30s. So I agree with Xanthi. For Harry, it's all about, I don't use them in the term flippantly, it's the game Harry plays. It's all about control, it's about domination. And he's a classic predator. He hunts not because he has a specific target, he hunts because he wants to get the pleasure out of catching them and doing what he wants, controlling them. And that's
the
how Harry...
ultimate power over life and death.
Yeah.
And do you think the predation that day was purely opportunistic?
Probably. I think from where the kids were, it's a reasonable chance. And, you know, people like that too, and Xanthi and I were looking at a serial killer recently, and it's a bit like they hit upon a few and they'll get a target. They know what they're looking for. These people are incredibly skilled. So I suppose 3 innocent kids on a beach that day, he had the right pitch, he had the right look. He wasn't wearing a plastic raincoat. He was a very presentable. You know, back in those days, we always watched out for dirty old men. I didn't see any. Harry was the exact opposite. He was absolutely pristine. So yeah, I think in his case it was just all about this game he played. His satisfaction was, I mean, with allegations that he abused his male children, allegations that he'd been abused as a 16-year-old girl, middle-aged women came forward. The guy was just, it was all about Harry's game. That was all it was.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it was opportunistic in that he wasn't targeting these 3 specific children, that they weren't, you know, being stalked or whatever. But I think he was possibly out on the hunt, and they represented, an opportunity to fulfil his particular fantasies.
Yeah, and God, there was this, the possibility there was this Good Samaritan routine that he played, where the kids have lost their money, the nice bloke comes up and says, "Oh, isn't that terrible? I'll look after you." The kids are already feeling quite disturbed, off-centre, quite needy. That barrier is broken down. So when a Samaritan comes up, you know, we all still think the best of people. So Harry comes up to help them. The fact that Harry probably stole the money deliberately to set the situation up isn't totally different. So he lures them in. That's his trap. And it works beautifully. And, you know, you get that. You've seen them operate. There's a moment where eye contact happens and you know that you're over that first barrier. And rather than stand back, the kids come towards you. You do it when you're interviewing people. You know when you're doing an interview with somebody how it's going to go when the person starts leaning forward and paying attention. And you know you've got it. And that's not dissimilar to the way these characters operate.
Do you think there's a risk with this style of journalism that it trains the community and children to look for the wrong kind of danger? Because these guys, these successful cold cases, they're the rock stars, the superheroes who've been able to get away with it. Whereas the real danger is the neighbour, the person they know, the relative, who has got a much more life damage and lots more bodies accounted for.
Yeah, well, these cases might be the rock star, but this case is one of many we've done. I think, certainly in the stuff that Anthony and I do, there's this broad sweep of anything from the intimacy of the story, one of our early ones we did, about a small girl, 11 years old, murdered by her sister's boyfriend. And it was legally an incredibly important case because there's a lot of issues at play, double jeopardy, of course, and all this sort of jazz. But you can take that one small issue and build it up. So I don't think the rock star cases dominate. I think they draw people into the genre, perhaps. But, you know, we deal with a broad canvas of cases, from those very small, very intimate, to something very, very grand, like the size of the Beaumont. So I don't think they overwhelm. I think the lessons come from each case. And for us, it's how you tell the story, because the lesson's a bad term, but how you tell that story is what gets people in. You might be bored to tears after the first 10 seconds of the Beaumont's, after the promo, and think, oh, I can't be bothered. So you actually have to tell a story and bring those issues into it. So cases like this don't overwhelm the audience. Each story's got different facets. Each story has important facets. So it's how you tell the story that will have the impact on you more than the bells and whistles on the familiarity of the case. I think that's something we have to place the story in context, tell the broad story, tell the human experiences, tell the resolution. I don't think that the bells and whistles or something like the Beaumonts will overwhelm people, because we tell so many stories and each story has to be told so well. So I don't think so.
I think there's a really important point in your question, which is that most violent abuse happens in the home from people who are familiar. And so I don't know if I would want to go down as far as saying we shouldn't pay as much attention to these ones, but I think giving more attention to the more regular violence that happens in the domestic violence space would be really good. So for that bit, I would agree with you. I think I was driving to work yesterday and they were reporting on this recent case in Perth where there was the tragic murder of a young family. And they said it was like maybe 8:30 in the morning, and the reporters mentioned a counter which is on the ABC website which says how many domestic violence incidents the police have responded to that day. 8:30 in the morning, it was already over 100. So there is a really important point about what is the regularity, or where else should we be putting our attention.
Well, we've had the problem with nephews they're country kids, they come to the city. When we quiz them, what's dangerous in the city, right? And it's bombs, it's terrorists, right? But you can get them to pay attention crossing the road, right?
That's not restricted to country people coming to the city.
Yeah, and so I think yes, there are bad people out there, right? But I don't know.
Let's go up the back. Amelia had a question.
If the panel can comment, what's Mr. Beaumont's current attitude? But Duncan, when you said that he is still close to the area, and you said that he's still waiting for the kids to come home, has he accepted that the kids would more than likely to come to foul play, or?
Oh yeah, I think so.
What's his current attitude?
Mr. Beaumont was about 93 or 94. Look, I think they still entertain that one glimmer of hope that the kids would come home, but they're resigned to the fact that they're dead years ago. But you know, you never give up that one little shred. And that's why these things are so important, because it will linger until they're found. So he doesn't talk about it very often. I spoke to an old mate of mine in Adelaide who'd known him for years and years and years, and they'd take him to the football every weekend. About 20 odd years, and he didn't mention his kids once, and they didn't ask him either. But so I think he's angry about it. I think Mr. Beaumont is being looked after by the police, kept abreast of what's happening. Still, there's that one sliver of hope that they'll either be found and it can be resolved. But yeah, resigned to what happened years ago.
Do you think him being in his 90s would at all push the police forward to say let's do this?
It'd be lovely to think
It
it
would
gets to
be,
get some
yeah.
resolution. And more so, poor old Mostyn, that is a detective who's been doing it for day one. Mostyn was absolutely horrified when they didn't get a result, just devastated. Because he believed for years that Harry Phipps was the bloke, the spot was there. And for a stoic old detective, he was bloody sad to see. But at the same time, he then pops up and comes out fighting and says where we're going to dig next. So it's that sort of spirit.
I think what's really important about these sorts of cases is that they start to change society's views about sort of real things that happen. So you talked about childhood innocence, and cases like this start to change society's view about is it safe for children. The topic that I think is becoming increasingly sort of top of mind is female sexual abuses of children. So a sort of truth accepted until pretty recently is that pedophiles tend to be men, and that's starting to change with cases coming out. What other sort of trends are you seeing in this space of things that hitherto haven't been really considered?
Certainly the female sex offenders is certainly coming out as one of them. So I would still say predominantly the majority of predators seem to be males. However, there are some trends with females. And we're beginning to accept that females do commit different types of crimes that before were very unheard of. And so the interest in that area is growing. I do think in this case we're looking for a male offender, but certainly not discounting females anymore when they are sex offences against children. So that's an area, as well as domestic violence by women and dual domestic violence within relationships is something I think that is kind of growing interest as well. So the gender crimes are really an area that is blossoming at the moment.
Blossoming is probably not the best word.
Blossoming interest in gender-based crimes.
Perfect. Bad.
Maybe add something that I'm interested in that I'm not sure that it's gaining public interest. The thing I find interesting is we individualise these sort of violent crimes. We look at who's the person to blame, and whether it be their gender or their socioeconomic status or something like that. But I'm interested in our broad cultural understanding and stories and narratives about violence. What do we talk about? What do we teach each other about through our popular media, through our storytelling like films and books? The idea of violence as a problem-solving technique is actually very strongly part of our culture. It's quite a difficult thing to challenge, and I'm not going to suggest here now that we have to throw it away altogether. There are certainly people who think we should. But even if you go back to childhood stories, even kids' cartoons, the idea that we solve problems through violence is actually there. It's in childhood cartoons. So we want to ask questions about who commits violence. I think we have to go back and ask, well, how do we teach people how to solve problems from a very early age? That's what I'm interested in.
Duncan? Yep.
I'm assuming they have the DNA of Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont?
They certainly do.
Good. Just checking.
We checked with them as well.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. Part of this game is you never leave anything to chance, just in case. And unfortunately, harsh experience suggests that some people do leave something to chance. So we're the pedantic bores of this world. Have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done that?
I think it was the first thing we asked, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah. And
Just
were
in
they
case.
ever able to get DNA from belongings of children like hair,
Well,
brushes and things?
It didn't exist then.
no.
And no.
But if you had a purse, a little white purse.
Yeah.
Oh, if we had a purse, we would be able to determine, hopefully, if that was Jane's by DNA that may be left on it. Depends on the storage, but even 52 years later, it's possible we could have got viable DNA that we could then match the parents. Yeah.
Can I just interject here as well? There's been a question that's came through a couple of times online, both on the live stream, and we opened up an online form before this, is could they still be alive?
It's possible. We can't rule it out until we found them, but everything speaks to the fact that they're no longer alive, that they were killed probably that day within around, I would estimate around 3 hours. I'm looking at other crimes that we see of child abduction when they're found deceased or not found at all. So I would think it's highly unlikely, but we cannot rule it out until they've been found.
I'm with you. I'm about 99% certain they are. But,
Never say never.
exactly.
Duncan, you mentioned at the beginning something, I'm not sure quite what you said about the family. Is that what you said?
Oh, sorry, the family.
I've never heard of
Oh,
that
an old
before.
Adelaide institution. There's,
Fascinating.
yes. It's interesting when you go to Adelaide, some people will deny that they ever existed, and other people will say, of course they existed. And it's bizarre. It's sort of Adelaide, sorry. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was allegedly a group of middle-aged gay men who preyed on younger men. Not uncommon, but these guys went far, far beyond that. And there are all sorts of bizarre stories about young men, maybe sex workers, that thing just disappearing. The people, the itinerant sex workers, people without connections or people whose connections have been pretty much diluted socially, disappeared and horrible things happened, basically. It was given some breath by the disappearance in, whenever it was, early 80s, of a guy called Kelvin. Local channel, I think Channel 9 or Channel 7 newsreader, Rob Kelvin, his son disappeared and was found just an appalling murder, really utterly appalling. The guy who was arrested for it was Bevan Spencer von Einem, who's still at the clink. And he denied, and von Einem was just curious, I'll be really quick about it. Von Einem was probably on the bridge at the Patawalonga swamp when they were draining it to find the Beaumont kids. It was Bevan von Einem, lovely piece of history. In about 1972, a guy called George Duncan was drowned in the Torrens River. He was down there sort of wandering around, see if he could find a bit of companionship that night. Members of the South Australian Vice Squad thought it was appropriate to throw him in the river, and his mate, they threw both of them in the river. One bloke got out, George Duncan couldn't swim and he drowned. Caused a lot of kerfuffle in South Australia when they really realised who the culprits probably were. His mate is crawling out, somewhat beaten and bruised from the Torrens, and a Good Samaritan comes, picks him up and takes him to Adelaide Hospital. The Good Samaritan is Bevan Spencer von Einem. I nearly fell off my chair when I read it. But von Einem is the ugly face of what the family was, the abductor, the seducer, and in many cases they believed the murderer. They thought he was good for about 3 or 4, but in that great Adelaide way, no, it's only the tip of the iceberg. So it's the shadows of Adelaide back in the 70s and 80s. There is a book written about it, but curious enough, when you go to talk to the author, he won't say a word to you. It's weird. I don't know whether it's true, but there is certainly a strong suggestion that it was. Good research project.
Is there any association with PIPs in it?
A high probability that Phipps was associated with people who may have been part of the family. It's that Adelaide society thing at that time, terribly, terribly cloistered, affluent, politically astute and influential. Real chance. Particularly as Harry used to frock up on a Saturday night and go down and see them. It was a very interesting world.
Any last questions yet?
It's about how unusual you said the crime was. Just in a criminal profiling type of perspective, do you believe that Phipps or whoever it was after one child and took all 3 for ease? Or do you believe that he wanted all 3?
Well, 3 would be tough. However, if you're going to abduct a child, abducting 3 children together, if you can gain the attention and win over the eldest, Jane, a very responsible 9-year-old, then it may actually be easier. Imagine all those children at the beach were with an adult. That's going to be really difficult. So I don't know whether they went for 3 or whether this was an opportunity that they saw that they got Jane on side and suddenly, they've got these 3 potential children. There's some suggestion that actually Grant, the 4-year-old male, was the main target, but obviously that's speculation until we know more about the offender, and again, until we find the children, figure out who the offender was and what their motivation was, it's going to be virtually impossible. But I think they just represented an opportunity, and possibly if this was a control-based crime, taking 3, if you could take 1.
I suppose just for someone like Phipps, who's obviously a complete control freak, 3 is extraordinary.
If you're talking about issues of power and control as well, especially.
He just climbed Everest.
Yeah, exactly.
And got away with it.
Yeah, got away with it.
All right, well, we might end it there. Thank you, Anthony, for FaceTiming in from the UK. Thank you, Ben, for coming from Adelaide. And thank you, Duncan.
Coming from Darwinhurst.
Coming from Darwinhurst. All right, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you very much.